All right, welcome, friends. So the whole point of this was to establish a conversation among faculty about how to rhetorically listen most effectively. We can use this for multiple different projects within 1301 and 1302, but the point is to have a conversation and to rhetorically listen to the three essays that we've chosen. And so rhetorical listening, as we learned from Dr. Krista Ratcliffe, is a stance of openness. It's a pause in the conversation. The analogy that I typically use involves video games. And so when you pause a video game, you're not ending it. You're not switching the game. You're not changing consoles. You're not giving up completely. You're typically pausing it so you can get on your phone and access some new strategy, some new information, and you can gain what you need to be more effective in the game itself. And so that's kind of how we talk about rhetorical listening. It is not about changing our own beliefs because somebody believes differently than we do. It is not about even modifying what we think we believe. It's about examining other people's perspective through 360-degree perspective and trying to grow our own beliefs. And so before we get started, let's have a moment where we introduce ourselves. My name is Jacob Arnold. I serve in the English department, and I teach anything with ENGL at the front of it.
I'm Rochelle Gregory. I'm the division chair for the English department.
I'm Kristen Weinsappel, and I'm an instructor in the English department.
I'm Lisa Smart, and I am also an instructor in the English department.
I'm Jared Entz, and I'm also an instructor in the English department.
I'm Landon Poole. I'm also an instructor in the English department.
I'm Jocelyn Pena, also an instructor in the English department.
I'm Jill Swartz. I teach in the English department and speech department and work with the honors program.
I've been muted, just like talking mute. But I'm Lauren Sullivan, and I'm an instructor in the English department.
I'm Amber Hunsaker, and same like everyone else.
All right, so we'll begin with Newt Gingrich's essay, which is in the first volume of this, I believe. You can find that on page 78. And it is titled The Willingness to Work for Solutions. And I'm going to start the 10-minute timer right now. So whoever had the first cultural logic and wanted to discuss this essay, please feel free to do so.
So I picked this essay for us to talk about. So I think maybe I should start and just kind of talk about why I picked it. I thought it would be a good idea. I align myself politically more left of center. I tend to vote more Democratic. I tend to see myself more progressive. And so Gingrich's essay is difficult for me. It's challenging for me to understand and listen with a stance of openness. And so I think that's all the more reason why I have to pay closer attention to what he's talking about and kind of work to kind of put aside my personal views and try to listen with understanding. So in my attempt to do that, one of the things that I've found is this theory on moral politics by George Lakoff. And he describes, and it's in my notes, he describes kind of a conservative ideology. If we're talking about the cultural logic of conservatism, he talks about it from the position of you have to think about conservatism as a metaphor, and the metaphor is the nation as a family. And his argument is that you want to see conservatism through the lens of this kind of nation as family metaphor that, and he writes, quote, a traditional nuclear family in conservatism is with the father having primary responsibility for the well-being of the household. So in this case, the leader of the country, the president, the cabinet, these leaders are much like the leaders in a family, that life is seen as fundamentally difficult and the world is fundamentally dangerous, that evil is conceptualized as a force in the world, and it's the father's job to support his family and protect it from evils, both external and internal. And so, you know, I see that quite a bit. You know, it's focusing on the leader as a strong, self-disciplined, temperate, restrained person with high standards who, you know, really kind of aligns with more authority, obedience, kind of fairness and justice to protect and support the family. And so when I was reading Gingrich's, I saw that quite a bit. You know, he talks about in his essay, he even uses kind of words like children on page 79. He uses words children and grandchildren. And he says, I am reminded that it is the quality of leaders, the courage of a people, the ability to solve problems that enables us to continue one more year and then one more year until our children and grandchildren have had this freedom, this safety, this health, and this prosperity. And when I started thinking about Gingrich's essay through the lens of like this, nation is family with the father at the head, whose job it is to protect and to, even if it's kind of strict, even if it might come across as, kind of a strict father morality, it made sense to see it that way. I don't necessarily agree with Gingrich, but I understand where he's coming from and the decisions that he's making a little bit better because of that cultural logic, so to speak.
I think I could segue pretty good off of that. I actually struggled with this one. I just sat and looked at this one for probably longer than the rest of them, and I almost gave up finding anything to say because to me it felt really nebulous at first. And it may have to do partially with because I noticed in the little bit of information we have on the back is that when he sat down to record the essay, he discarded what he'd written and spoke the piece extemporaneously. So I feel like I could kind of feel it evolving, trying to evolve it into something. But after I struggled with it for a while, I honed in on some of the specific language that he used, particularly where he says in the first sentence, I believe the world is inherently a very dangerous place. So I thought about this word inherent, which means existing in something as a permanent, essential, or characteristic attribute. So these dangers that he are talking about are not the dangers of nature, but of people. Therefore, I see him saying is he believed that people are inherently dangerous. So from that point, I connected it, and looking back and understanding that he comes at this from a Christian background, that I connected this with the cultural logics of original sin. This idea that the religious idea that sin entered the world through Adam, and therefore, because we are all part of Adam, we are all fundamentally flawed from the beginning. I pulled some information from an article called The Human Evolution and a Cultural Understanding of Original Sin by Benno van den Toren. And he says in here, when he talks about the logics of original sin, he says the position sometimes called realist in that every future human being was in a real sense, present in Adam. When Adam fell, human nature itself fell within him. And the Christian tradition sees the human race as kind of a federal or covenantal unity. Adam was a covenant head, just kind of like the father you're talking about is the head of the family, the legal representative of the human race, and therefore God accounts or impugns Adam's sin to all of his offspring. So this idea that we're born into sin, but then it's also through cultural transmissions. He takes it a step further, and he talks about how the human being is inherently a cultural animal. We inherit the positive and negative aspects of the culture that we are raised in, and those negative aspects are in connection with our original sin that's making us culpable to it. So our culture is a vehicle for transmission of evil from one generation to the next. And the goal, hopefully, is to cull the evil from our culture and focus on the good of our culture, which is a kingdom of God from the Christian perspective. So that was how I looked through it.
I
Mine
really
really
didn't think of it
segues-
that way. That's good.
Mine really segues in kind of with both of yours. So I looked at this essay through this lens of leadership styles and how politicians tend to lead using fear rather than respect, right? And so then I found this leadership, expert, Tom Flick, and he writes that leading with fear breeds anxiety, cynicism, distrust, and intimidation, all of which can be poisonous to any team or organization. These consequences make transparency and honesty nearly impossible, killing necessary forms of communication. If people are too afraid to bring up an issue, there's a clear dysfunction within the organization. With fear, the rational discussion gets limited, which ultimately leads to poor decision making and a lack of action. So, for me, the first half of the whole essay is just like, we can turn it to France. We might have another Holocaust. We might have another Vietnam War. And so, he kind of uses all these bad experiences in the past, 100 years to explain how, we as Americans should band together. But because he's using that fear, it actually does the opposite. Instead of trying to band together, fear makes us protect ourselves. It doesn't share, collaboration. It doesn't promote community. All it does is say, I can't trust any of you because you're not looking out for me. I can only trust myself, because there's this fear that if I can't do it, or if I can't do it, no one's going to protect me. So this essay, to me, was just about showing how politicians and leaders, when they lead with fear, create a sense of isolation and, make us feel independent instead of as a community, which is counterproductive to what they are trying to do. So.
But I think talking about that leadership style, and I'm glad you brought that up, because something that I did not know about Newt Gingrich, I remember, of course, vaguely when he was Speaker of the House. I wasn't really paying much attention to politics at that time. But to me, this fact, he mentions how he learned from his stepfather, a career soldier, and then he spent some time as a child in France, post-World War II France. So that kind of, indicated to me, so if you grow up as a child and see these war-torn areas, and this is what you hear, and if his stepfather, if these were the conversations that he was a part of as a young person, it would make sense that this would be the leadership style that he would employ, and that he would hold these fears, because for him, they are very real, maybe more real to him than some other folks. So while I have to say, I'm, when I saw Newt Gingrich, I kind of like bristled a little bit, but this actually made me understand him a little bit more and to gain a better perspective of his childhood and maybe what helped shape these ideas that he holds. So I appreciated this inclusion.
So we've got about 10 seconds left on our timer for this essay. I'm curious, those who didn't speak, what cultural logic did you choose to kind of view this essay? What lens did you use? I chose anarchism because I also am not in the cultural logic of conservatism, nor am I in anarchism. And so I really wanted to look at this because I have issues, and it's hard for me to listen to ideas of American or Christian exceptionalism. Those challenge my rhetorical listening muscles. I have to work out in that area. So I chose something that was completely kind of like off the grid. And so one of the quotes that I had found really interesting came from, and I have it here, came from a writer named Gerald Casey. And this is the end of the quote: states are criminal organizations, all states, not just the obviously totalitarian or repressive ones. And so I tried to view this through that lens of how would somebody who believes that it doesn't really matter how altruistic or good or bad the state may be, a nation state in and of itself is inherently evil. And I tried to kind of, stretch out and view it through that. But what other cultural logics and lenses did we look at this essay through before we move on to Temple Grandin's essay?
I chose nihilism.
I approached
did
this.
Also. Oh, please continue, Jared.
No, go for it.
Well, I
approached this
a lot
also
like,
from.
There's like a lag. There is a
delay here.
There's a
Go
delay.
ahead. Okay.
But yeah, logic of nationalism, because I was seeking to understand the conservativeness that I saw here. And what I realized while I was reading a book by Rich Lowry, and it's called, it's about the power of nationalism and not a bad thing, which to me sounds appalling. But there's a quote in that book in which he says, having a functioning democracy requires demos, or people who feel attached to one another. And when I looked at it that way, I started to understand a lot more of Newt's fears, and especially his fears of not a standard by which to unite people. Otherwise, you can't sort of function as this family that is a big part of being. That's what I got.
I was just going to add that I approach this also from kind of this cultural logic of fear, and particularly fear of impermanence or fear of change, kind of like Amber was saying. But the source I found was actually more of a human interest piece from the Washington Post, something that was published very recently. During this current election, and I thought it was particularly interesting as an example of maybe a more human immediate look at this kind of cultural logic. And so it looked at Randy Bunch from McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, who had commissioned a mural of Donald Trump to hang outside of his business. And it has several quotes from him, and I'll give you a couple. It looks at Bunch looking at this painting. It says, that expression, that twinkle in his eye, that's what I see. I see a person who loves America and the people in it. And then one more, he says, he's the best president I've seen since I've been born. God first, pro-life, freedom, and right on down the line. And again, I get this idea in an election that has been the most divisive one that I've ever seen. Taking a news source that historically is left leaning and looking at a person who seems to be very much right leaning is in itself an act of, I think, rhetorical listening. And I thought that was particularly interesting, and also to give insight into the nature of this idea that I want things to be like they used to be. I think that this person is going to represent that for me and for my family. So.
Very cool. So the next essay that we're going to look at is on page 87 in this, I believe, the first volume, and it's called Seeing in Beautiful, Precise Pictures by Temple Grandin. Did anybody have a cultural logic that they viewed this through that required them to use rhetorical listening?
I did.
Well, I'll start. Oh,
sorry.
no.
So, because there's a lot of this idea that autistic people can't speak for themselves. So I wanted to look at this through the lens of autistic people being independent. And it definitely almost sort of to the normative against autistic people. It's so rare that they actually can speak on their own behalf, because she is her own experience. And I was pretty shocked by it. As an autist, I had a unique experience with this essay.
Yeah.
Talking.
I was gonna. I'm gonna piggyback on what Lauren said, because I agree. That was my cultural logic too. I was coming at it from the cultural logic of neurodiversity, that there are different types of kind of neurological experience in the world, and that all of those are valuable, whether it's a person who is, who sees the world in pictures like Temple Grandin and is autistic, or whether it's, somebody who has, a mental illness and they see the world through the lens of their mental illness, that they're not broken. Somebody who's autistic isn't broken. They just engage in the world in a different way. That's the argument of rhetorical. That's the argument of the neurodiversity movement, if we're talking about it through the lens of rhetorical listening. Lisa, Jill, Jocelyn, do y'all?
My nephew is 18 years old and he's autistic. And I asked him to read this essay and give me his perspective because I thought that would be so interesting. He's also actually a vegan and has been vegan for the past 2.5 years. And so this essay really spoke to him. It spoke to his heart. He did not know who Temple Grandin was or is. And after finding out about her and finding out about everything that she does, he's just going down a rabbit hole right now, as we know with a lot of autistic individuals, when they find something that really intrigues them, they latch onto it. And he has just been, my sister's been calling me like, what have you done? And he's just so obsessed with all of her work. I know he's ordered one of her books, I think this week on Amazon. And he found it very interesting, something that piggybacking off of what Lauren was talking about, how he doesn't see what he has as a disability. In fact, in any appointment he's ever been in, whenever he sees a therapist, whenever he sees a doctor and they, refer to his disability, he corrects them. I'm sorry, did you mean ability? And so that just really, I just wanted to chime in with from firsthand experience from an autistic person as well, just like Lauren was talking about from the cultural logic of autism itself. I thought that was pretty powerful and it really impacted my perspective as well.
Well, something that that has always intrigued me about Temple Grandin and her work is, as someone, I've grown up working around cattle, working around agriculture. I've been a part of, I've seen feedlots. I've helped load cattle into, help pen and load cattle onto trailers. And it is a very, it can be very disconcerting, a very disconcerting process, even for someone who loves animals and who has watched it 100 times. But I was sort of intrigued by this idea of, she says how she sees things in pictures. And so that led me to want to know more about how animals see. And animals do see light on a different kind of spectrum. Cattle see, the way that they see images is very different than the way humans see images. And it was very comforting to me to kind of, read her explanation and then to know that that's what she's using this tool to design facilities that are more humane and it's just very comforting to me as someone who has worked with animals, who loves animals, who's worked in production agriculture. For someone to take this approach, I think is a very positive thing. And regardless of her, is it her, is it autism that allows her to do this? Maybe, maybe not. Could other people learn could she teach others how to see things in this way? And that was sort of my takeaway from this essay initially.
I would like to piggyback on what Jocelyn and Kristen also said. What I think Temple Grandin does is, when you first hear her name, you automatically are going to think autism. But I think what she does with this is like what Kristen said. I also grew up around animals and farms, and we did this sort of thing. Her autism is just very much just a part of her, but it's not everything that she is, And I think what is incredible about what she has done is students also who are autistic relate to her, but they don't just relate to her on a level of autism. It's like there's so much more out there in the world they could be doing, they could be thinking about. And I love to see that it moves from an essay about Temple Grandin, who has autism, which everyone knows, to this Temple Grandin that she has done this amazing thing to give animals comfort. It's just, it takes you on this amazing journey. And I think it's just an amazing essay. But she does, you think about, she writes about the difficult things in the world, and yet she did something. I don't know how many people would have thought to do something to make an animal's, transition or whatever you want to call it, peaceful. I mean, it's just, anyway, I thought that really kind of piggybacked on what Jocelyn and Kristen had said.
There's a train where I am. I don't know. I'll quit talking if it is it too loud? Is the train okay? I'll just say real quickly. It just sort of reminds what I get out of her. I mean, the first time I read it, it's everything that you're talking about disabled people having something to offer, and not just that they're less than. It's just different. but also her work ethic and like the work of micro and dirty jobs and valuing work. I don't think she sees the work she does, like we're talking about working with animals. And there is this sort of sense now that, I mean, we all work in higher ed and we believe in getting a college degree, but there's value in all different types of work. So I guess the cultural logic that I'm looking at, and of course she works in higher ed too, but she's doing this very sort of manual labor kind of job that it has to do with the way we value different people's professions.
Yeah, mine's just super quick. I talked a little bit more about the last one, but when I was looking at what her beliefs were, I just thought she was very pragmatic. I looked at through the lens of pragmatism, and someone else said, you know, could she teach this way of looking at the world to others? And I think absolutely. She says on page 88, I believe doing practical things can make the world a better place. And then farther down, she says about her work. She says, in my mind, I had a picture of a way to make that dying as peacefully as possible. She says before that every human and animal eventually dies. So in pragmatism is the idea of ideas are essentially instruments and plans of action. So just like how she talked about how her mother told her to be nice, that didn't mean as much as putting it more in a pragmatic sense. She's like, well, don't do this because you wouldn't want that being done to you. So in a way, I think she kind of, the way she looks at the world, she cuts through a lot of the BS and says, okay, what words really have meaning? What are the things that really have meaning that I can actively do to make the world a better place? So I just saw that she maybe naturally is pragmatic.
So just for students,
Landon,
because I took some notes to kind of summarize the cultural logics. We have Lauren's autism advocacy. We have neurodiversity. We have this cultural logic of animal welfare, rural populations, working class, and pragmatism. So quite a few different cultural logics going on there. Lauren, I'm gonna pause.
Agreeing with Landon because autistic people, there's a culture involved, and that culture is practicality. That is probably the most profound elements of our identity. I'm amazed that you tapped into that, Landon.
Thank you.
So any other final thoughts on Temple Grandin's essay before we move to our final essay that we're exploring today?
Make mine kind of real quickly. I looked at my cultural logic was ecofeminism. That yes, Temple Grandin notoriously is autistic, but I think another important aspect to her work is that she's a woman in a very male-dominated, culture. That she broke down barriers for a lot of women to enter agriculture and animal science. So I did some research on, the 1970s feministic movement and kind of what that meant, and looked at how rural women helped change what farming and agriculture looks like.
That's really cool, Amber. That's really cool.
That's a really good one.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
So our final essay that we'll be rhetorically listening to is on page 129 of this, I believe, volume 1, and it is "There Is No God" by Penn Jillette. So this is one that I wanted to talk about. As I was sharing before we started recording, many students chose this essay because of their personal religious beliefs, and they found it very challenging, and understandably so. Using rhetorically listening, we can understand how somebody who holds strong religious beliefs could be offended, could be triggered by this essay. And so it's one that I really wanted to have a conversation about. And so I tried to choose a cultural logic that would help students kind of work through it in a more pragmatic way. And so I chose humanism as my cultural logic, and I'll just share with you a little bit of their third manifesto, which was established in 2003. And this is from the American Humanist Association. And it says this: humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. The life stance of humanism, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience, encourages us to live life well and fully. It evolved through the ages and continues to develop through the efforts of thoughtful people who recognize that values and ideals, however carefully wrought, are subject to change as our knowledge and understandings advance. And this again is from the third manifesto of the Humanist Association here in North America. And so what I really wanted to encourage people to do here is, again, not to change their personal religious beliefs. Nothing in rhetorical listening asks them to lose their faith by any means. All it asks them to do is to pause, and with a stance of openness and an open mind is to consume somebody else's perspective. And so what I encouraged people to do was to look at Penn Jillette's life and to begin to empathize, very similarly to what everybody here has done with the first two, is to empathize with the experiences that he's had and to empathize with some of the things that he has gone through, the loss of his mother, his experience with religion from the beginning, and to try to put themselves in Jillette's shoes to think about why he might say what he says with such candor, with such, he's very fervent. And if you've seen anything of what he does, he leads speeches on, converting people, or I guess unconverting people. I don't know if we can use the opposite of that, but and so I wanted them to look at humanism because the humanist movement is something that's very intriguing to me. It holds a lot of the same ideology as Christianity does in regards to being altruistic, being kind to your fellow man, lifting up all of your community, serving people holistically. However, there's no promise of an eternal reward with humanism. People simply do it because it's what's right, because it's what's good. They're not doing it for a mansion in the sky. They're doing it because that is what we are designed to do, is to serve one another in a community. And my hope was that they see that though Gillette is not talking about humanism specifically here, he's talking about being beyond atheism, as he says in his second sentence, that he might be doing so, if we look at it through rhetorical listening and with empathy, from a stance that it's just our duty as humans to serve other human beings, whether or not we get some reward for doing so. And so that's the cultural logic I used. What else did we view this essay through?
So I'm watching The Good Place for the first time ever, and I love it. And I'm about halfway through the show, and this idea of the moral desert is the first thing that came to my mind when I read, this essay. This idea that you do good things on Earth for the sake of doing good things instead of having this reward at the end, right?
Amber,
So,
in the Comp 2 class, did you see or in the Comp 1 class, did you see the theme, what we owe to each other?
Yeah.
That's from The Good Place.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
So when I read this essay, that was the first thing that came to mind, because it's just prevalent in my life right now. So I was like, oh, that's a cool connection. The moral desert.
I identified humanism as well, so I won't add too much. For Jacob went in a lot better detail out of it than I had notes for. But I think it's the idea that not only are we doing it because it's the right thing to do, but we recognize in humanism it's the right thing to do because what's good for society is also good for me as a person. So it's putting your community ahead of your personal goals. I think humanism, it focuses on everyone's experience and how can we help everyone to have the best human experience while we're here on Earth as possible. So I just wanted to add that to it, that's all.
I approached this essay kind of with the lens of a duality of both science and religion, because that's something that I've kind of seen throughout my lifetime in education. We're taught about the theory of evolution, and then you go home and tell your parents about it, and, oh, what are you learning in school? And it's just this, it takes a lot of life experience to realize, you can believe in science and you can also believe in God. They can actually coexist. And I found this wonderful article by William Breitbart, who is a psychiatrist here in America, and it's called God and Science, Can We Believe in Both? And basically, to summarize what he says, he ends his article saying, what conclusions can we draw from all of this? We will obviously all draw very personal and individual conclusions. I know that I am a scientist and a palliative care physician who is in awe of the material world, but I am also a human being who will continue to wonder and explore what lies within, without, and beyond. And so I wanted to take that perspective of, it doesn't have to be one or the other. People are, well, evolution says this, well, the Bible says this, or what have you, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, of course. Really kind of understand that both can coexist and we can believe in both. And that duality is important for really kind of proceeding this essay, in my opinion.
I really like that. I just kept coming back to gender in this essay, because to me, this essay has a very male perspective, just in the language that he uses, his absolutes. There's some snark in there. And I feel like as a male, and as a white male especially, this kind of gives him, and probably because I have heard him speak, so I know his tone a little bit, I'm familiar with it. But to me, his word choices, that's another long-winded religious way to say shut up, or another 2 words that the FCC likes less. He kind of gets in his little snark, but to me, it has a very a male tone. I don't know if women could maybe get away with saying some of these things in the way that he does.
I think of community. I think he's trying to build community, because I think a lot of people do have community in their faith. And I read up on him, going to his church youth group, and I was very involved in my church youth group growing up. And so I can imagine this personality coming to church youth group and challenging everything, and being asked not to come back. And so, but I think he's trying to build community amongst non-believers. I think he's desiring community. I think we all desire community. So he still wants community, just not in this traditional sense.
I think too, Jill.
Jill, I got
think
that.
He is searching for this idea of community. He also has this idea of accountability, in the sense of, I loved what he said on page 131, where he says, for him, believing there is no God means the suffering I've seen in my family, and indeed all the suffering in the world, isn't caused by an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent force that isn't bothered to help or is just testing us, but rather something we all may be able to help others with in the future. No God means the possibility of less suffering in the future. I also think he takes a really strong stance here and says, the kind of dysfunction and things that are going on are on me. It's my accountability. We can fix them. We don't have to just sort of say, oh, well, God's going to fix it. I think he's very pragmatic in that sense. And he also is about personal accountability, I think, within his community and within his family.
I also think
I see that.
Between non-religious people, part of what I got was pro-social. This is sort of the cultural logic of being, and showing that atheists don't eat babies. He's sort of showing that the values are very similar, and there can be some connection.
I see the philosophy of empiricism here as well. That's the thing that initially stood out to me as I read this essay, and this is one that I probably like my students struggled with a little bit, but I see. And I'm no expert in the works of David Hume or anything like that, but I do see a bit of that idea that we can only place our trust, we can only place belief in the things that we can directly observe, the things that we can directly measure and experience. And so while I see that, I also see Gillette. He seems to take that one step further, because where Hume says if there are things beyond what we can directly experience, then this philosophy can't apply to those things. Gillette seems to say, yes, it can. The very fact that I can't experience this means that I will believe against it. I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but that was what initially struck me as I was reading this essay.
No, I think that's a great point, Jared. That's something that we talked about as well in the classroom, well, digitally, in the classroom, is that there's certain ways that philosophers have talked about the acquisition of knowledge throughout the ages. And there's knowledge that's innate, that we were born with, and you could go biologically there of like, take a breath. You know to do that, right? Swallow, you know to do this. And when you don't, something has, gone awry. But all other knowledge is through experience. And if we can't explicate and explain our experiences, then they are more easily negated, more easily disproved. And so I think that that's what one of the things that was very hard for students to grapple with was this idea that, well, I've grown up and this is my personal faith, but I can't really explain it empirically. I can't really say, well, this is what I've experienced and it applies to everybody, because they've also lived enough life to know that their experiences don't define everybody else's experiences perfectly. And so I think that they found themselves in kind of that rock and a hard place inside this essay of going, he's kind of talking about everything that I believe in, but negating the one thing that I believe in at the same time. And so I found that talking about how we acquire knowledge through experience was really beneficial to rhetorically listen to this essay as well. But really cool. What other cultural logics? Anything else on this one? We had about 40 seconds left on Gillette's essay.
Is
I
shock
think it was-
value a cultural logic?
Say that again.
Shock value.
Mm.
I just feel like, I mean, there's something about when he threw in Jello, a mention of Jello, that he's just really, I'm going to piggyback maybe on what Kristen's saying. I mean, he knows that he's stirring things up here. I don't know that shock value is a cultural logic, but I just wanted to throw that in. He's wanting to be shocking.
I agree with that, especially just seeing the title alone. I mean,
I thought it was super important when I read through this essay to understand the difference between religiosity and spiritualism, that there's a difference in definition, that religion by definition has a god or a deity that you worship and praise, and spirituality is just this sense of something bigger than yourself. Not necessarily a deity, but something, humanism, compassion, this idea of we're all in this together. I think that was an important aspect for me to take into consideration, that there is a difference between the two.
I think it's also coming back to rhetorical listening. We've had this conversation, and would you say if you came into this essay as, say, Catholic or Baptist, you're leaving this conversation an atheist? Probably not. Like, you can understand and still hold your values. Your faith can still have can remain the same. You just understand Gillette a little bit differently now, or his position or these cultural logics a little bit differently.
All right, friends. So any final words on rhetorical listening that you want to leave our delightful and wonderfully brilliant scholars with?
to piggyback off of what Rochelle was talking about, I think one thing, especially in considering this essay and what it challenged students to understand, is that rhetorical listening doesn't ask you to agree with a person. And I feel like when students understand that, okay, I'm safe, just because I'm reading something like this doesn't mean that I'm, going to purgatory. And as soon as they understand that it's okay to have a conversation with someone who doesn't believe the things that you believe, and that's okay, it's just more about the journey of trying to understand their perspective. It does not mean you have to agree with them. No one is asking you to do that. And I think that makes rhetorical listening a bit more acceptable and a bit less scary to students.
That makes me want to explore the cultural logics that lead to them to be resistant from being open or having a hard time doing that, because I think there's cultural logics that got them to that point, and that's what we're battling with that now a bit.
Cultural logics, I think too, from what Landon said, cultural logics are deep. You know, I think it piggybacks onto what Rochelle said as well about the Newt Gingrich essay. Conservatism, is very much rooted in family, the family before, your father, your grandfather, it's generational. So it's not like just they boom decided to come up with these. It's very deep seated, and so they feel of almost sense of, gosh, I'm betraying my entire family or whatever, but it's just, if we're going to all be humans and coexist, we have to, like Jocelyn was saying, practice this rhetorical listening. I have had some students that are very conservative or Christian, and they took on this essay, and I have to say they did it in such a wonderful way. They were very compassionate. It opened their eyes in a way without compromising who they felt they were. If anything, it for them, they came to the conclusion, maybe this is what I should have been doing all along as a Christian, is to be compassionate and understanding. So I think the essay in some ways did do some good things for them, but rhetorical listening is the key to everything, in my opinion, everything. So.
And embrace the discomfort, because I think if we all are honest, there's something in each of these essays that made us a little uncomfortable in some way, and that's okay. In order to be challenged, I think it's good for us to sort of not just embrace the discomfort, but try to understand why we're experiencing it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having this conversation with us. And if you have made it out there in the digital landscape this far, know that we love you, we respect you, we thank you for being here. And rhetorical listening is a lifelong journey, just like finding your voice as a writer. We all practice it all the time from multiple different cultural logics, and it's always delightfully uncomfortable, just like Kristen was saying. So please feel free to email us with any questions that you might have along the way, and know that roadblocks are going to be set in front of you, and that's why we're here, is to help. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you for watching online.